Welcome to the final part of this argument, which is part 4, where we discuss the implications of the attributes of X. A quick summary of conditions 1 through 4 is that the one who believes that their moral values are absolute must have a source of their moral values, which we are calling X, that cannot give contradicting moral values and cannot be man. Below, a fairly comprehensive list is given of theories that attempt to explain where we got our absolute moral values from. Since the giving of absolute moral values is something that only X can do, remember condition 2, whatever it is in these theories that is giving the absolute moral values is claiming to be X. Now, whether or not it can actually be X will be decided on the basis of our two attributes of X. The first category for what X is that X is man. We discussed in part 3 why that cannot be the case, so this column can be thrown out. The second category for what X is that X is nature. This means that our moral decisions aren't really our decisions, but rather are decided by the natural laws. One example of this is that our moral choices are determined by our genetic makeup, or that our moral choices are determined by the environment in which we grew up. For example, my genetic makeup might cause me to go rob a bank or love others. If that happened, somebody would have to come home afterwards and decide that robbing banks is morally wrong, perhaps on the basis that societies that rob banks don't last as long as those who don't rob banks. In that case, these moral values would be subject to the same problems as discussed in the X is man category. One doesn't know that preserving society is morally right, and even if it was, what preserves society could change, leading to a change in moral values. As long as man is the one that defines what is right and what is wrong, the moral values cannot be absolute. The third category is that X is the moral values. Some believe that our moral values do not need a source, that they exist somewhere out in the cosmos. In this case, just like X is nature, man decides which moral values are right and which ones are wrong. So the fact that X cannot be man rules out this category as well. Our last category is that X is a deity. We have Allah, the Islamic deity, Jehovah, the Judeo-Christian deity, and Krishna, who is a Hindu deity. There are many more deities, but all of them claim that they are the source of absolute moral values. At this point, one might object, saying something like, so why is the basis that deities provide for their moral values any better than the basis that man provides? That's a reasonable objection, and the answer is twofold. Usually, the moral values that deities give come from their character, which does not change. Since their character does not change, the moral values that come from their character do not change, which allows for them to be absolute. For example, some say that God is loving all the time, which means that we should be loving all the time. Imagine trying to do this with man, whose character changes on a daily basis. Some days man is good, and some days man is bad. So if you try basing moral values on the character of man, you will get moral values that contradict, which means they are not absolute. The other attribute of deities that allows their moral values to be absolute is that they are eternal. If they were not eternal, then there would be a time where their character, from which our moral values come, did not exist. At that time, there would be no moral values, which means that the moral values we have now cannot be absolute. Note that man is not eternal and therefore cannot do this. That's basically why the deities in different world religions can provide absolute moral values, for those who are wondering. The purpose of the next slide is to use condition 3 to narrow down the list of deities to select which ones can be X. It might seem like a detour, but it is relevant, so please stay with me. Most religions operate by the principle of salvation by good works, which means that if a person does enough good things, that God will overlook the bad things they have done and let them into heaven. All world religions agree with premise 1, which is that if a deity is just, then it punishes wrongdoing. Using modus tollens logic, we get premise 2, which is that a deity that does not punish wrongdoing is unjust. Note that I am not saying that punishing wrongdoing is just. I am merely stating what all world religions state. Premise 3 states that deities who offer salvation by good works both claim to be just and do not punish wrongdoing. They claim to be just when they have a moral code that we're supposed to obey, and punishment is a result of disobeying it. At the same time, they fail to punish the wrongdoing of the one that has done enough good works. According to premise 2, not punishing wrongdoing is unjust. So the deities that offer salvation by good works are promoting both justice and injustice. Note that I am not saying that punishing wrongdoing is just, and that not punishing it is unjust. I am merely stating what all world religions state. They say that to punish wrongdoing is just, and then they turn around and don't punish wrongdoing, which makes their action unjust by their own definition of justice. So if a deity is promoting both justice and injustice, then it is giving contradicting moral values. We determined earlier that X cannot give contradicting moral values. Therefore, any deity who offers salvation by good works cannot be X. To illustrate why deities who offer salvation by good works make a moral contradiction, imagine the scenario of a bank robber standing before a judge in court. He says something like, "You know, Judge, I really messed up when I robbed that bank, but before that I did a lot of nice things. I volunteered at soup kitchens, I was nice to my neighbors, and even after I leave this court, I will live my life on a totally different path." If the judge let that man go, we would say that by the judge's own definition of justice, he is acting unjustly. The judge obviously believes that part of justice is punishing wrongdoers, or else the man would not be in his court. Yet he does not punish the wrongdoer, which makes his action unjust by his own definition of justice. One could not get absolute moral values from the judge because he is telling us to do contradicting things. In the same way, deities who offer salvation by good works let wrongdoers go unpunished on account of good works that have nothing to do with whether or not they should be punished. So how is this going to help us which deity can be X? Select which deity can be X. The answer is that only the Christian deity does not offer salvation by good works, and is therefore the only deity that can be X. All other world religions say that if you do enough good things, you can earn God's favor and he will let you into heaven. Christianity offers salvation by God's grace through faith, not by good works. One does good works as a result of being saved, but the good works do not save them. Lastly, this faith is not a good work because it is the gift of God. At the same time, the Christian deity is the only deity that is just all the time because it is the only deity that punishes wrongdoing all the time. Either the wrongdoer is punished for it in hell, or Jesus is punished for it in the wrongdoer's place. This is how the Christian deity is able to let people into heaven without ignoring their wrongdoing. Because he does not offer salvation by good works, only the Christian deity can be X. We determined from condition 4 that of our list of sources of absolute moral values that man has proposed, that X cannot be man, cannot be nature, and cannot be the moral values. Now, we have determined from condition 3 that of the deities, only the Christian deity can be X. That leaves the Christian deity as the only possible source of absolute moral values. To summarize, conditions 1 through 2 stated that the one who thinks they have absolute moral values must have an absolute moral value source, which we are calling X. Conditions 3 through 4 stated that X cannot make moral contradictions and that X cannot be man. Conditions 3 through 4 are such that of existing theories, only the Christian deity can be X. In other words, only the Christian deity can allow for absolute moral values. So what can you, the viewer, do? There are 3 options. The first is to invent an X that meets conditions 3 and 4. For example, you could say that you got your absolute moral values from a race of aliens on Neptune or from a dog. As long as the dog or the aliens are not man and do not make moral contradictions, they could theoretically be X. Of course, there would be absolutely no evidence to suggest this, so I wouldn't suggest doing that. The second option is to reject condition 1. So any moral values that you thought were absolute are no longer absolute. I know that it is popular now to reject condition 1 and say that our moral values are relative. But before doing this, you really should consider the implications. This means that things like genocide, stealing, and rape are morally right in some situations, and things like loving others and treating them with respect are morally wrong in some situations. It's like C.S. Lewis said, morality is relative until someone takes your seat on the bus. So I urge you to consider the consequences of rejecting condition 1. I would not suggest it. What you should do is the third option, which is to accept the Christian deity as the source of your absolute moral values. What someone who meets condition 1 cannot do is accept an existing source of absolute moral values that is not the Christian deity. So their absolute moral value source cannot be man, it cannot be nature, it cannot be the moral values, and it cannot be any deity that is not the Christian deity. I realize that not all of my viewers agree with the conclusion I have made. If that's you, I encourage you to do your best to poke a hole in my argument. If you can, then good for you, because the argument no longer applies. But if you can't, then the argument still applies to you. And part of being intellectually honest is to accept the consequences of what we know to be true. That's all. Thanks for listening. If you like these videos, please click the like button or share them.